Is evolution a theory? For those in a hurry, the short answer is no. But if you have time to watch the race, then prepare for an exciting contest. But before we rerun the most famous race in history which never happened, we should first mention the punters, namely two pre-Socratic philosophers who lived around 500 BC. In the right corner, Heraclitus, who lived in Ephesus in what is now Turkey, believed that everything is in a state of flux. Change is the only constant. We never step twice into the same river. In the opposite corner is Parmenides, who lived in the Greek colony of Elia in what is now Italy. He believed that the one is the only reality and nothing can change. Any appearance of change is an illusion. Zeno, who was a follower of Parmenides, contrived a number of clever paradoxes to prove that since motion involves change, it is an illusion. In the paradox of the race, he had the Greek hero Achilles matched against a tortoise. Zeno was betting on a dead heat. Achilles gave the tortoise a head start of 10 paces and the race was on. Here we see their initial positions with the tortoise 10 paces in front. Achilles bolted and covered the 10 paces, but the tortoise had in the meantime advanced 1 pace and was still in front. Achilles then advanced 1 pace, but the tortoise was still ahead by 1/10 of a pace, as we see in the bottom line, and then 100th of a pace, and then 1,000th of a pace, and so on ad infinitum. And since Achilles will never get to infinity, he can never pass the tortoise. QED, motion is an illusion. The flaw in Zeno's reasoning is easily seen if, instead of mentally juggling ideas, we express the problem mathematically. We could write this out as an infinite series of numbers filling pages and pages with a sequence of ever smaller fractions until the pole reached the Moon, or Jupiter, or the Andromeda Galaxy, but the sum of these numbers is not infinite. Zeno did not have the convenience of decimal numbers to do his sums. Come to think of it, he didn't even have Roman numerals. But using our decimal notation, it is easy to see that Achilles would catch the tortoise after 11.111111 or 11 1/9 paces. There is a whole branch of mathematics devoted to figuring out whether an infinite series will converge to a finite number or diverge to infinity. For example, the sum of 1 plus a half plus a third plus a quarter plus a fifth and so on is infinite. Well, if you square these numbers and add them up with 1 plus a quarter plus a ninth plus a 16th plus 1 on 25 and so on, the amazing result is pi squared on 6, a small number, just over 1.6. The point of this illustration is to show that you can say something in words which has a certain rhetorical plausibility, but it is only when you describe it in numbers that you can see whether it is true or false. This is how science works. This principle is clearly illustrated in the way we came to accept that the Earth orbits the Sun and not vice versa. Common sense tells us the Earth is fixed in space and things in the sky move. The moon rises nearly an hour later every day, but the ancients noticed that the stars seem to get up slightly earlier, continually advancing until a year later they are back in the same position. The ancients concluded that the stars are attached to a celestial sphere which rotates around the Earth like the Sun, but slower by 1 degree per day. However, wandering stars or planets did not follow the regular pattern, but would sometimes rise later and move in the opposite direction through the constellations of the zodiac. Astrologers like to keep track of these things because if you wanted to attack the king next door, you would want Mars, the god of war, on your side and not in your neighbour's house when you chose to engage him in battle. To predict the future, they needed to know where in the zodiac the planets would be next year, and they worked out a mathematical model for the planets which had circles on circles, tracing out epicycles. This rather complex system worked up to a point and could tell you roughly where Mars or Jupiter would be on some future day when you planned a wedding or a battle. But it was not altogether accurate, and it was known that sometimes planets strayed further than they should. Nicholas Copernicus realised that the two circles in an epicycle were mathematically equivalent to a planet travelling around the Sun on one circle, viewed from the Earth travelling around the Sun on another circle. He had these ideas published after his death in the mid-16th century. It looked neat. The only problem was that it used the same circles as the old system, and it gave much the same errors. This is why, when Galileo advocated the heliocentric system a century later, and was famously forced to recant, it wasn't just a question of religious dogma. The new theory did not give better answers than the old epicycles, and there was also the question of why we don't fall off the moving Earth, or even feel its motion. Johannes Kepler lived around the same time as Galileo, but had more freedom to investigate the heliocentric model as he lived in Protestant Germany. He had access to accurate observations of the position of Mars and found a better fit to the observed path by squeezing the circle into an ellipse, with the Sun at one focus. He went on to apply this model to the other planets. As well as ditching the long-held view that celestial bodies must move in perfect circles, he also showed that the speed of a planet can vary. A planet moves faster when it is nearer the Sun and slower when further away, so that it always sweeps the same area in a given time period. The pie slices are the same size. This was a scientific advance. Kepler's mathematical model fitted very closely with the observed motions of the planets, although he could not explain why their orbits should be an odd shape like an ellipse. His model was accepted by the more mathematically minded, but others remained unconvinced. Even Francis Bacon, who is generally credited with inventing the scientific method, thought that on balance the evidence was for a stationary Earth. It was Isaac Newton who resolved the issue a generation later with his laws of motion and gravitation, published in 1687. His mathematical model accurately described how gravity could hold the planets on Kepler's elliptical orbits around the Sun. Newton said it is not in the nature of planets to move in circles, but like any other object, they would travel in straight lines in the absence of external forces. The curved orbit is an effect of gravitational attraction pulling towards the Sun. To prove this, he turned Zeno on his head and divided the path of a planet into small steps, forward and sideways, until they became infinitesimally small, and in the process, he invented calculus. This was a universal theory. The same laws which apply on Earth also govern the heavens, and explain why we do not fall off the Earth as we travel through space. His theoretical model so accurately described the observed motions of the planets and the comets that there was no need for somebody to look down from space to see if it was true. For the next few hundred years, Newton's methodology became the paradigm for how science should work. A scientific theory is a mathematical model of the parts from which the behaviour of the whole can be derived. If the theory always gives the right answers, so that the numbers agree with reality, you can be reasonably sure it is true. If sometimes it gives wrong answers, then you need to ask why. Your theory is either wrong or is only true within limits. As it turned out, Newton's laws were not the whole story. The material world is not a continuum, and you cannot keep dividing it a la Zeno. Newton's laws do not work for particles inside atoms, and you need quantum mechanics instead. And when things approach the speed of light, you need Einstein's relativity. It would be unfair to say Newton's laws have turned out to be wrong, as they hold true for most everyday problems. Newton's laws are good enough to fly a rocket to Mars. But if you try to use Newton's theory beyond the boundaries where it applies, it'll give nonsense. This has been a long detour on the way to discussing evolution, but there are a few points to note. Firstly, a scientific theory is generally a mathematical model of reality, and is only of any value if it both describes what you can see and gives you information about what you can't see. Secondly, just because a theory is right in one domain doesn't mean it is correct everywhere. Evolutionary ideas go back at least as far as the Pre-Socratic Greeks, But Aristotle taught that the species are fixed. His ideas dominated science, such as it was, for nearly 2 millennia, and fitted with Genesis, which also implied the species are fixed. By the 18th century, much of Aristotle's science had been challenged, and evolutionary ideas were gaining strength. But then, the fixity of the species gained a second wind in the person of Georges Cuvier, who rose to prominence in revolutionary France. Called the second Linnaeus by some, Cuvier introduced the principle of correlation, which says certain characteristics will always go together in animals. Paleontology was still a new science, and often a fossil find would be only part of an animal, or might be mixed with the bones of other animals. More than once, using his principle of correlation, Cuvier used only a few bones or even just a tooth to successfully predict what the whole animal would look like once better fossils were found. As an aside, there is a story that one night a student prankster broke into his room dressed as the devil and threatened to eat him alive. Cuvier coolly replied, "You have horns and hooves, so you only eat vegetation." Cuvier mercilessly attacked Lamarck, who proposed that animals gradually change in response to their environment. The idea that an animal is an organic whole, where no part can change without affecting all the other parts, convinced Cuvier that evolution was impossible. He sounds a bit like an Eleatic. Darwin, however, sounds more like a follower of Heraclitus. While trained in Cuvier's thinking, his observations in the Galapagos Islands strongly suggested that species do change. He found large variations between species on the different islands, but it appeared highly likely they were all related to and descended from species on the mainland. Darwin proposed that natural selection accounted for these differences. By a process of small variations, immigrants from the mainland had gradually adapted to the unique environment of each island. Yet, if he'd been aware of some of the other developments in science about the same time, Darwin might have drawn different conclusions. In 1859, the same year that Darwin published Origin of the Species, Louis Pasteur did an experiment using flasks which breathe through convoluted piping to show that stuff only starts growing in soup if it gets in from outside. This was contrary to the theory of spontaneous generation taught by Aristotle and others, who thought, for example, that mites and fleas could arise from dust, that maggots arise in rotting flesh, and frogs emerge from the muddy banks of the Nile. This is not a million miles from Darwin's speculation that life might have started in a warm puddle. It was just speculation, an idea, without proposing a mechanism by which it might have happened. For evolution to work, Darwin needed a mechanism to pass on characteristics from generation to generation, but he had no theory for it. Like Aristotle, he thought heredity was somehow in the blood. Meanwhile in Moravia, a monk named Gregor Mendel was experimenting with peas in his garden and published his laws of genetic heredity in 1865. Mendel died in obscurity and his work gained little attention. By the time he was rediscovered in 1900, Darwinian evolution was almost universally accepted by scientists. Mendel's laws said inherited traits come in two choices, like tall or short, purple or white. One of these choices is dominant, so that when you breed a purple with a white, you get purple in the first generation. But out of 4 offspring of parents with mixed traits, the dominant trait will appear in 3 and the recessive trait in 1. For example, with big P for purple and little w for recessive white, out of the 4 combinations PP, PW, WP and WW, only WW will be white. The 3 with a P will all be purple. Mendel was kind of lucky to discover this, as generally, characteristics of organisms are affected by several genes. This could trick you into thinking there was continuous variation. Mendel discovered the choices are binary. Mendel's rules for genes were a bit like Kepler's laws for planetary orbits. He showed heredity followed mathematical rules, even if he did not know what mechanism lay behind the rules. But clearly there had to be a physical cause for the mathematics underlying Mendelian genetics. Work in the early 20th century confirmed his laws and showed chromosomes were involved. The challenge for science was to work out how these chromosomes inside a cell could transmit inherited traits. The mechanism was finally understood when the double helix structure of DNA was unravelled in 1953. Inside the chromosomes, all our genetic material is coded in two very long chains, like a twisted rope ladder, with pairs of cross-linking bases as rungs. The ropes are made of sugar and phosphate, and the cross-linking bases, known as A, T, G and C for short, act like the digits of a numerical code. In human DNA, there are about 3 billion of these pairs. DNA is replicated by unzipping the chain and building the complementary chain on each half. If Darwin had known about genes, he might instead have proposed that the Galapagos Finches descended from a mainland prototype which had all the available options in its DNA. The finches with the gene combinations which gave them the traits best fitted to the local environment on each island thrived, and hence they were in effect selected by nature. Like evolution, Oz never gave anything to the Tin Man that he didn't already have. Louis Dollo proposed a law of irreversibility in 1893, which says once an organism becomes more specialised, it cannot evolve backward to the way it was. We can see that starting from an original population with dominant gene A and recessive gene B, after successive generations of breeding to suit a particular environment, the population may become all BB or all AA as the opposite combination slowly disappears. If the environment then changes, it is impossible to recover the opposite combination. If the variability has been bred out, the options for further adaptation cease, and extinction follows. Evolution can only give what you already have. Implicit in evolution is the idea of a process of continuous innovation by which complex organisms arise from simple ones. While natural selection just says that the player who gets dealt the best hand of cards wins, evolution says that somehow new aces keep appearing in the deck. The supposed mechanism by which this happens is by making mistakes. Darwin's ideas about heredity were wrong, and even Mendel could not have imagined how genes are transmitted by molecules, since at the time, many scientists still questioned the existence of atoms. The molecular theory of matter was still in its infancy, but was a prerequisite to developing a theory of how heredity worked. A few years after Darwin's Origin of the Species, James Clerk Maxwell published his work on the velocity distribution of the molecules in a gas. It was in one sense conjecture. First you had to accept that gases like air are made up of particles, which bounce around randomly like billiard balls, but which cannot be seen even with the most powerful optical microscope. Maxwell's theory was that pressure and temperature, which we can feel, are due to the collective random motions of billions of invisible, undetectable, unmeasurable particles. He was a man of faith. Maxwell realised that the molecules could not all be moving at constant speed, but that their velocity must vary randomly. For example, the speed must be zero at the instant when they hit a surface and then bounce off. Nevertheless, if the pressure and temperature of a gas remains constant, then the energy and the volume of gas must also be constant, and so the average speed of all the molecules must remain constant. It was a statistical theory involving averages of huge populations. When it comes to high-power mathematics, his theory was a corker. Ludwig Boltzmann developed these ideas over the next decade and showed temperature is proportional to the root mean square velocity, which is the square root of the sum of the square of the velocity of each particle. When we talk about the sum, there are around 300 million molecules in 1 cubic micrometre of air. So this would be a monstrous sum to add up by hand. But the majority of German physicists did not believe in atoms, and Boltzmann encountered continuous opposition to his molecular theory. He was excluded from conferences and rejected by journals. Eventually, he got so depressed that he took his own life. But he was proved right. His highly mathematical theory has been shown to give the right answers to numerous problems in thermodynamics and chemistry, so we can be highly confident that his equations represent reality, even though nobody can see an atom or directly check what gas molecules are doing. BOLTZMANN also came up with the concept of entropy, which is a measure of the number of ways you can arrange the particles in a system, such as gas molecules bouncing around in a box. Entropy always increases because random systems always move towards the average. If you turn off the oven and open its door, the kitchen and the oven will eventually reach an equilibrium temperature, with an entropy higher than the sum of the entropies of the initial hot air in the oven and the cooler air in the kitchen. Conversely, the cooling process will never reverse so that the faster moving molecules in the room spontaneously congregate inside the oven to make it hot, while the kitchen gets a little cooler. This does not violate conservation of energy, so is possible. However, entropy would have to decrease. While not impossible, the probability that this could happen is so low, it will never happen. Not in a billion years. Not in a billion galaxies. This seemingly random detour is to make the point that, while the molecular theory of matter and the behaviour of random systems were not understood in Darwin's time, they were a decade or two later. The laws of physics say that the natural order of things is to move towards increasing chaos. Complexity generally does not arise randomly in physical systems. Darwin's hypothesis was contrary to the newly discovered laws of physics. And yet, there is an unstated assumption in all discussion of evolution that the billions of ordered systems in nature are the result of a spontaneous trend towards order. In the early 20th century, it became clear that Darwin's theory had problems, that it had to adapt to the new discoveries in genetics. The modern synthesis was developed in the years between the wars by a number of men who are not household names and don't have Australian capital cities named after them. When scientifically trained people talk about evolution, they are generally referring to the modern synthesis rather than Darwin's theory. When we see the amazing behaviour of some species or other in nature documentaries, evolution is usually invoked as a catch-all explanation. For example, when we see a crowd of penguins huddled together on the Antarctic ice, it is mind-boggling that these little creatures can survive the freezing conditions. That they are struggling to survive goes without saying, but their evolution has nothing to do with their courage or cleverness or effort, which is kind of implied although always denied. The traits and behaviours which allow them to survive in extreme conditions supposedly evolved because there was an error at the molecular level when copying a gene, and then another fortuitous error, and then another, and then a few hundred more, which were passed on, giving penguins the ability to survive the winter. Or so the story goes. Reproduction involves copying billions of nucleotides, and sometimes there are errors in the copying process. Some errors get corrected, and some have no effect. But generally, a mutation is going to be bad rather than good. We fear mutation from radiation and toxic leaks, which we usually associate with birth defects. The Mighty Hulk was aided by gamma rays, but he's a comic book character. The bad mutations die off, but can good mutations lead to increasing complexity, and far from being a rare fluke, occur often enough to bootstrap all of life on Earth into being? There is no numerical model for this. Although we know a lot about DNA and can even edit it, there is much we don't know. With 3 billion nucleotides, a human egg or sperm contains the equivalent of 750 megabytes of data, about the capacity of a CD. That is a lot of information to pack into one molecule, but it does not appear to be enough for the job. We are told that less than 2% of DNA encodes proteins, and the rest is junk. This sounds like a man who tried to play the piano with his feet while wearing steel-capped boots and complained the keys were lacking tactile feedback. Our bodies consist of around 30 trillion cells altogether, and are often understood in terms of 10 major physiological systems which function together to make everyday life possible. The many components of these systems are made from different kinds of cells, which may then be analysed as many thousands of molecular level systems. A theory of evolution must explain how these complex systems could assemble themselves and use numbers to show that the pathways it proposes are credible. One such molecular level system is hemoglobin, which transports oxygen throughout the bodies of all vertebrates. To work efficiently, it has to soak up oxygen like a sponge in our lungs, hang on to it fairly tightly during transport through our blood vessels, but then easily release it to all the cells in our body. A single red blood cell contains 270 million hemoglobin proteins. Each one contains 4 iron atoms and 2 alpha and 2 beta chains, each consisting of 141 or 146 amino acids respectively. This structure allows it to bind to 4 oxygen molecules. 4 genes code for the alpha chain and 2 for the beta chain, thus specifying which amino acids, out of the 20 available, to use and in what order to arrange them. We're not talking about something which was casually thrown together, but an extremely complex data structure. Hemoglobin is much the same in all vertebrates and supposedly emerged some 400 million years ago. It is assumed it evolved from a more simple molecule, such as myoglobin. Myoglobin has only a single chain, made up of 154 amino acids joined to 1 iron atom. Myoglobin is found in muscle tissue and has a stronger affinity to oxygen than hemoglobin, so it can strip oxygen from the red blood cell with little effort. But myoglobin also appeared less than 450 million years ago. The window of time in which myoglobin and then hemoglobin could have evolved is relatively narrow. A numerical model of how this came about would have to show how it could happen in the time available. DNA copying errors must have been frequent enough for hemoglobin to emerge relatively quickly, but then slow enough for it to remain stable for 400 million years. Adding to the difficulty, this is just one molecule in one system, which had to evolve in parallel with thousands of other physiological systems. Bone marrow had to learn to pack 270 million proteins into a red blood cell. Iron had to be directed from dinner to bone marrow. You have to have a heart and blood vessels. Hemoglobin was of no use without all the other systems. This takes Cuvier's principle of correlation to another level altogether. I could be accused of a Zeno-like error if I claimed that even with infinite time, mutations could not produce the complexity of living systems. I haven't produced the hard numbers here, so my argument is somewhat rhetorical. But conversely, the advocate for evolution has to demonstrate that it can be done in a finite number of iterations in the time available. The men on the map of Australia who formulated the modern synthesis did not know about DNA or even much about molecular biology, but a theory of evolution must deal with the problem of sequences of very big numbers. The pathway from the simple to the complex needs to be more than just an idea. A theory must detail the sequence of data structures where every step along the way can arise from a possible error at the molecular level and also manifest as a viable species with some sort of survival advantage over the previous structure. Heraclitus and Parmenides argued about fixity and change. Change is all around us, but it is change within limits. Natural selection is readily observed, but it is about selecting from what already exists. Evolution proposes new things are brought into being by miscopying less complex structures. This supposed overarching principle by which order arises from chaos is not a theory. 160 years after a Victorian gentleman had an idea, it is time to produce a proper, quantitative, scientific theory, or otherwise admit that there is no theory of evolution.